Hello, I'm Jerry Stewart. Soon I'll be 69 years old, and that means I've lived through quite a number of eras in our nation. And one thing that I have found to be true in our nation today is we're getting further and further away from good common sense. We're getting away from not just telling half-truths, but we need to be telling the whole truth. And we're getting further and further away from that. Now, I want to take a moment and tell you a story, but first I want to ask you a question. Do you think that the language and the way people talk in our nation is different today than it was, say, 20 years, 40 years, 60 years ago? Oh, yeah. It's not that they're inventing new words. It's that people are becoming more and more acceptable to any vile word that comes out of anyone's mouth. You know, there was a day when you would never use the F word. And maybe some people in small crowds or people who had a cussing habit would throw a few out. But there was always somebody there to say, you just don't talk that way, especially if there were women and children around. Well, what's happened is little by little, this word, this F word, has become more and more used, more and more acceptable. And today, well, let me tell you a story. The other night, I took Kelly to a baseball game. We're sitting in the stadium, and a group of young people come and sit behind us. They're probably college age. And they were sitting there a few minutes, sort of talking loud, talking back and forth. And one of them began to use this F word. I mean, people all around. The stadium was full of people. And there wasn't a thought that he was, oh, excuse me, or I shouldn't have said that. And probably over a matter of only a few minutes, this F word was used quite a number of times. And so I looked around to see if anyone else was disturbed by that. I was just kind of curious. And Kelly and I looked, and some of the folks were our own age. They were just turned forward toward the game. No one seemed the least bit bothered. So I'm always the one. I turned around and I said, excuse me. I said, but I would really appreciate it if you would not talk that way. We've got women, we've got children here. We're here to enjoy the ball game, and we don't want to hear that. Well, they received what I had to say, and then they began to talk between themselves. One of the young men said, what did we say? And he said, well, he told you that you said the F word. And he says, what? I didn't use the F word. I didn't say anything. So we talked for a couple of minutes. It was all proper and polite. And they received what I had to say. And no one got huffy. No one got mad. And then we went on through the game, and I never heard any more cuss words. After the game, Kelly and I sat down and said, do you see just what happened? There were 20, 30, 40 people maybe within the scope of this young man's voice, and not one person said one word. Some had small children. There were women there. There were folks our age, and nobody said a word. And so we said, don't you think it's pretty unbelievable that we've become so accustomed to certain words that now they're just acceptable? And you say, well, what's the big deal? What is the big deal? Well, here's the deal. First of all, there are things that are right and things that are wrong. There's words to use and words not to use. It used to be that if someone wanted to tell they called it a dirty joke, they wouldn't tell it in front of the children. And they would do their best to bring up the children in the way that they would have character and moral fiber. But what's happening today is, well, think about it this way. Let's say a young boy walks into a candy store, walks up in front of the clerk, takes a candy bar, opens it up, eats the candy bar, puts the wrapper down, doesn't pay for the candy bar, and just walks outside the store. And no one says a word. So what do you think he's going to think? He's going to think, well, it must be okay. I walked into the store, I got a candy bar, I didn't pay for it, I ate it, and no one said a word. So it must be okay. So do you realize that if you hear language out in public, especially from young people, and you let them talk freely, and you don't approach them and make any comment to them, asking them not to talk that way, do you realize that when you don't say anything to them, their conclusion is it must be all right? And it becomes part of their regular language. I can tell you that, well, let me give you another example. I have a smartphone. I don't know how smart our smartphones are. But the other day I was sending a text to someone, and I like to use the microphone because I can talk better than I can type. And I looked down at what I was about to send, and in my text was the F word. It wasn't like, do you want to use this word? Or maybe it was a misspelling or something. The word was there. So the conclusion is my phone now accepts the F word as part of its dictionary. Do you understand what's happening in our nation? Little by little by little by little, the slippery slope is washing us all down into the mire and the dirt, and people are losing respect, people are losing moral values, and whether you like it or not, whether you say it or not, it's true. It's happening. Now let me end with this little story. There's a story that some scientists were busy trying to do a test. And so they took some hot grease and they took a frog. I'm not trying to offend anyone who has a sensitivity to having any cruelty to an animal, but this is what they did. They were testing the reflexes of a frog. They got the grease hot. They dropped the frog into the hot grease, and in a fraction of a second, the frog hopped out because it didn't want to be there. It knew that it wasn't the right thing. It didn't want to be in that hot grease, and it hopped out. So then they put the frog into the cool grease. The frog was sitting in the cool grease, and then they turned the fire on ever so slowly. Interestingly enough, their report and findings was this, was if you brought the grease up to a heat very, very slowly until finally it got to a boiling, that in their experiment, the frog never noticed the heat. That's what's happening to our nation. So you say, what shall we do with this, Jerry? We've got to speak out. We've got to speak up. We've got to help those today who have believed that certain things now are acceptable. We have to remind them that they're not acceptable, that they're not right, that that's not where we want our nation to go. And I will promise you, this happens to me a lot. I guess you would say, confront a lot of young people with their bad language. And I always do it in a polite way. I always pray before I do it to make sure that I don't come across in the wrong way. And you might think, well, if I were to say that to somebody, maybe I'm going to get punched. You know what? I've made the confrontation many, many times, and never once have I been punched. In fact, I think in every instance when I shared my concern with the person, they apologized and they didn't do it again in front of me. So, want to make a difference in our nation? Rather than just sitting around and being frustrated and wondering what you can do, start by standing up with the way the young people are talking and encouraging them to talk and walk in the right way. I'm Jerry Stewart with a little common sense. God bless you.